Alrighty, so we are now live. Welcome everybody who's tuning in. My name's Crazybeard. I've got Carl Wheezer's Redbone here. What would you like to
Yes.
be called, Carl?
Just call me Corey. That's fine.
Corey. Okay. So we're just gonna have a brief little chat. We've got a couple of topics in mind, including Stalin and education, a couple other things like that. We'll have it to about 45 minutes to an hour, and the last good bit of that, 10, 15 minutes, will probably be Q&A. So we'll go ahead and kick it off. Would you like to start with Stalin?
Let's kind of. I think we should lead there a bit later on because that
Okay.
might be a bit more heated. So I guess can we talk a bit about theory
Sure.
and sort of the foundations of Marxism. So I want to lay out how I view Marxism fundamentally as a theoretical structure, because every theory sort of is builds on a foundation and has sort of thing that's followed it. And I want to lay out how I view it. And I want you to tell me if I have it wrong. So from what I see, you might have dialectical materialism at the bottom, the idea that the structure of societies, the structure of human interaction is fundamentally reflected by physical reality, where essentially there's no room in this theory necessarily for metaphysical or spiritual ideas, other than as tools of subjugation of the proletariat. Does that make sense? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so with dialectical materialism, one thing to add with that too is you mentioned the metaphysical thing. There's a great thing that Stalin wrote. It's called Anarchy or Socialism. He basically describes in that the basics of dialectical materialism is where we look at reality as influenced by class, right? Like a shoemaker would consider himself petty bourgeois, even
Yeah.
if he's in even if he works for a company, even though he's not actually petty bourgeois, his class makes his reality. Basically, that's a very easy way of understanding dialectical materialism, but basically,
I mean, the big thing that always sort of when I was reading about it, it focused on was that sort of key distinction between that society and class is fundamentally formulated on power hierarchies and power structures, right? That there is a power dynamic fundamentally, and often this power dynamic is um, cruel and unusual and unnecessary, and that sort of leads into this historical dialecticalism, which is about how history itself can be understood as the theses and antitheses of different power groups struggling for dominance. Would that be accurate?
yeah. So to put it more simply, basically everything's a class struggle. Everything since the beginning of time has been a class struggle.
Okay. Yeah, and so then from there, you kind of get all what I would see the more fun and interesting things that we can squabble about: labor theory of value, um, you know, uh, alienation of labor. All of these things sort of kind of tie into those fundamental things. So I think one place that we could start that'd be interesting is what are your views on religion? I think you said you were a Christian, right?
Yeah, so I differ from a lot of my peers, right? A lot of my peers, like Corvated, for example, who's in the chat, would say abolish religion. Marx himself called it the opiate of the masses.
Uh
In
huh.
my opinion, I don't think that's necessarily, needed. I also think that that kind of brings a lot of opposition because there's a lot of people that are religious. And it's to different degrees, right? Some people are very, very what's the word, orthodox in their thinking. And there's
Mm-hmm.
others that kind of use it as a I don't know, a moral code almost. But I honestly believe that it alienates a lot of people if you say, "Oh, let's just abolish religion," because so I'm a Christian, right? You
Mm-hmm.
don't see me practicing in a way where I tell everyone, "Believe what I believe, or I'm going to kill you."
Yeah.
No, I don't. I don't try to subjugate anybody. My walk with God is my walk with God. Everyone else can do what they want. They have free will. So I personally don't agree with that part. I personally don't agree that it's the opiate of the masses that Marx describes. I believe that Marx gets it more from like the Catholic Church, for example. I think more like centralized, organized religion is kind of the problem. I
Mm-hmm.
would say we probably don't need a pope. We probably don't need a centralized religion, but
Mm-hmm.
I think it's asinine to say, well, you can't believe this or you can't believe that. I think it just breeds resistance, honestly.
See, the problem is, though, I think that religion, in a way, is a bit like a Christian religion specifically is a bit antithetical to Marxist ideas. Like they're a bit contradictory, because a Christian religion would preach about the individual divine connection with God, right? That you yourself have this direct connection, and that it's from the individual's actualization that they meaningfully make impact into the world. But and so that's sort of a hyper individualism. That's where individualism got its start, was really in these Judeo-Christian religions that preach those things. And I think that's probably why Christianity is a widespread Western religion. It's so deeply individualistic, and that seems contradictory to the sort of collectivist ideas
So
that Marx talk about.
while I see your point, I'm sorry to cut you off. While I see your point,
Mm-hmm.
I disagree because like I can personally say my walk with God is between me and God. When I say that, I mean like, you know, whether I sin, whether I don't sin, whether I tithe, whether I don't tithe. But one thing that I carry with me is love others, right? Because when Jesus was
Mm-hmm.
on earth, he was asked, "What's the most important commandment?" He said, "Love God, love others." And that to me is a very socialist idea. I mean, if you look at Jesus, what did he do when he was on the earth? He went around, you know, healing the sick and feeding the poor.
Mm-hmm.
Like Jesus wants us to care about our neighbors. He doesn't want us to focus on just us.
Mm-hmm. And I will say, just to make this clear, I am a very religious person too, but in a different way, I guess. So I totally empathize with your religious beliefs. But the reason why I say it's a bit contradictory is because what I see as the fundamental. This is where, and I'm gonna get, I'm gonna kind of make a little bit of a hackneyed phrase with the horseshoe theory. There are some areas where I see very eerie similarities in communism and fascism, and not everything. There are some distinct opposites, but this is something where I see similarities, and both have a tendency for purity, that they want. I would see communism and Marxism desires a purity of thought. They want people to think the exact same way, to have the same class consciousness, the same ideology of how things work, about how the world should work. That that essentially you should be acting as an agent of the collective. That you are acting as somebody to help your fellow community and fellow man. And fascism obviously would be ethnic, racial purity, purity of the body, those sorts of things. And so that's why I'm very concerned about that. And that's why I find it contradictory to a lot of Christianity and individualism, because in communism, it doesn't seem like there can be a diversity of thought. Like in every single time there is some sort of communist revolution, the first thing that is very quickly established is that everybody has to think the exact same way. If you question the way things, the theory that is put forward by the state, usually if it's going to be, a state sort of revolution of that sort, then you will be put into some re-education camp until your brain is changed back to the way we want you to be, or until you die and work to death. So that's sort of what I'm seeing, and that's why I'm really confused that you can take this individual stance, because in any communist society, well, in every society that, like for instance, you look at China, what they
So
did
I'm
is they.
really sorry to cut you off, but just to kind of address that
Yes,
point
please go
you
ahead.
made earlier, I would disagree with that because I think you can have individual thought that affects just you. I think where it becomes a problem is when you try to push it on somebody else. In a communist society, like let's say I was the general secretary today, I would allow religion to continue. The thing that I would say is, look, you can't push it on other people. You can't make other people believe the way you want them to believe. And yes, there's going to be some things that have to be done away with. Like, for example, exploiting the workers. We won't have CEOs anymore. We won't have that individual drive to be, number one. We'll have more of a collectivist mentality. But I don't think that your individuality goes away. You can still be an individual. It's just that's a personal walk. That's not something you can push on somebody else anymore.
But it's to me. I mean, if what you're saying is true, then history would sort of correlate with that. But what seems to happen is that any single person with any difference of opinion on anything, and you might see it as, well, it only affects myself, but I mean, there seems to be this push always in any communist society for everybody to think exactly the same, and there is, I think, a danger that you're not observing that even with you. So let me try to phrase this correctly. So with you, you might be able to somehow um, spark, like, go through the Bible and find ways to say, I mean, because there's parts of the Bible that say respect your your slave owner and all of that. You might be able to say, well, those are specific explicit excerpts that don't make sense in the context of the Bible, or blah blah blah. So you're kind of going through, and I think this is a good thing to do with a religious text. You are sort of cherry picking and seeing what is useful for your life and adopting that. Wonderful. That's
Yeah, you
fine.
have to look at it in a modern context, right? Like, and that goes with theory too, right? We're not going to do the same thing Stalin did, for example. We're not going to outlaw homosexuality, for example. There's going to be modern. There's going to be modern. What's the word I'm looking for? Modern adaptations on what we've seen in the past. I would say a really good example of what something I would want would look like would be like Burkina Faso, run by Thomas Sankara. That would be a really good example.
Okay, it was that. Can you remind me what that was? Was that an African country revolution?
It's an African company. Yeah, he only ruled for, I believe, 4 years before he was assassinated. But he had a very huge focus on women's rights for number one, and then he also built a lot of schools. He built a lot of hospitals. He planted a lot of trees. His idea was, I don't want any foreign help. I don't want any Western help. I don't want any help from any other countries. I want to make Burkina Faso good on its own. And I mean, it's very hard to find anything bad about Thomas Sankara. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, I think I've read a little bit about him, and I definitely find him a very interesting man, and I would say generally positive, view towards him. He wasn't like Mao. He didn't seem too much like Stalin, so that's very good, because I think those are not good people. But let me try to finish the point I was making there.
Sorry.
So, no, it's so cool. I just want to capstone it to get to the point. So you have come through that sort of realization through your individual journey through the Bible and all of that. But what ends up happening is when a large group of people are given this text that is said that this is holy, this is sacred, the words in here are deeply meaningful, go out and investigate, they're going to come to different conclusions than you. A lot of them are going to come to conclusions that say, hey, I'm an individual. If other individuals want to work for me and I can show them that I can do better than everyone around me, that I'm more efficient as a manager, as a leader, then they should be able to follow me, and that is their individual right. And I mean, if you just look at cults in general, they always have that sort of hierarchy where there's some guy at the top who you could say is exploiting the people below him, and all of that sort of arises. And there's so much that emerges from religious ideas that you might not be taking away, but I think that many other people would. And I think that's what happens when that's why in every single large-scale communist revolution where you have multiple cultures, multiple religions inside the country, they seek to either unify it under one state religion of most of the times nothing, because they're so terrified of that diversity of thought emerging, because that's what's really dangerous. I mean, that's why Stalin was so worried about the kulaks, or so worried about the sort of
Right,
small.
so I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but we're getting on to a lot of things all in one. So let's start with we'll start with the thing you said about people coming to different conclusions about the Bible. Mm-hmm. So that is where the state would have to intervene. Yes, there's no secret. I'm ML, right? The state does have a lot of power in that structure. The state would definitely have to step in and say, okay, well, you cannot let your personal beliefs affect anyone else. And I think that goes to any religion, not just Christianity. Your personal beliefs end with you. If you want to go off and you want to, I don't know, go starve on a mountain, you do that. But if you want someone else to follow you and do that, and you make them do that, that's where that becomes a problem.
But what if that other person independently decides to go with you and starve on the mountain with you?
I would say we need to curb that as well. We need to say, look, you need to keep this into a non-centralized thing, right? Your walk with God needs to remain with yourself. I'd still be okay with like local churches, but outside of that, I think that's where we need to squash that.
See, that's the problem. I feel like it's a very, I feel like that's just so non-feasible. with any religious philosophy, because the main thing that happens with any religious group is that they come together and they discuss and create cultural harmonies and ideas, and it's a naturally sort of family almost effort. That's why there are churches. And these people are going to develop beliefs and ideas that are going to completely contradict the state, and it's going to lead to unbelievable amounts of tension and problems. And that's why I keep bringing up these big revolutions as direct evidence of this. This isn't just me saying, well, this might happen. This is what happened, and this is why those were squashed and destroyed.
But you know what's great about the history? That means we can learn from it and we can handle it a different way. I'll be the first to admit there's been mistakes in the USSR. There was mistakes in China's revolution. There's mistakes in every revolution we've had, and there will always be mistakes. We have to move and learn from them. I think it's totally feasible to create a balance to where you can believe what you want to believe and still follow religion. Like, honestly, capitalism and religion don't necessarily go hand in hand, right? Like, at least for me particularly, I would love to see all homeless people fed today. That's not how it is. So, I mean, no matter what belief system you have or what government you have or what economy you have, there's always going to be some kind of melding that has to happen. There's going to have to be some compromises on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, look, I know you're saying that, and I don't think we should stay here, because I think we're just going to have to leave it and disagree, because we only have an hour. But
yeah.
but I really do. I want to finish on this, and you obviously can have the opportunity to respond. I think that a lot of your opinions about how societies and communities are going to work is deeply is deeply optimistic in a flawed way. At least optimistic. And for me, it's catastrophic. I would hate to have people's freedoms to do what they want curbed in the sense of some global state. Like the idea is terrifying to me. But I think you underestimate the power of religion as a motivator to cause conflict and change and problems within the society. And that if you give people the same book, and in the book it says, very simple things like we should stone homosexuals, we should do all of this, do all of that, even though, and the state says, well, no, those aren't the correct interpretations. This is the correct interpretation. It's not going to be convincing to everybody. I always think fundamentally what happens is you're sowing seeds of discontent just by allowing these ideas to flourish. And that's exactly why communism has this deep intent on purity of thought, because any diversity from the state's opinion or the collective's opinion can cause tragedy and problems and internal disagreements. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, so kind of address that. So we'll talk about the correct interpretation example you gave right there of, stoning gays, for example, right? Mm-hmm. I think that if we were to have any revolution and we were to have a socialist state, the first thing that would have to be defined is, what are universal rights? What is it that we're going to do as a socialist society? And I mean, obviously protecting the LGBTQ community is quite high on the list, right? Mm-hmm. I think that would supersede religion, right? And that's where, and you and I are going to disagree on this, but that's where I think it's compatible. I think if we're willing to, and maybe some people won't, maybe they'll have to be kind of trained how to do this, but some people are going to have to learn how to surrender some of their beliefs. And I know that scares the heck out of you, but I, for one, am okay with that, because I'm tired of watching the news and seeing, another hate crime, another this, another that. And then one more thing I wanted to address. So I actually study world religions as a hobby, right? Outside of political theory, it's one of my favorite things to study. I've studied basically all the major world religions, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, you name it, right? Mm-hmm. The majority of the world religions that are, popular, they focus on one central thing. They focus on enlightenment. And normally the enlightenment that you reach is through loving others in some fashion or another. I honestly think that's completely compatible with socialism. I think it would be an uphill battle, but we could sell that to just about anybody, I think, if people would listen.
Okay. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you for that. So I think
it's been fun so far.
I think we should sort of move on into what do you want to move on into?
Well, you mentioned the kulaks, and I kind of wanted to address that because that's a
Yes.
very big topic for me.
Hmm.
So basically, I'm going to oversimplify the fuck out of this because we're only 20 minutes in. Stalin said, "All right, kulaks, you're gonna collectivize. You're gonna be the breadbasket of the USSR." Kulak said, "No, I don't think so. They burned their own crops, they killed their own cattle, they killed their own sheep, and they rebelled." And a lot of people don't tell you this, and I have a source for it that I can get you later after this if you want. Stalin sent over 300,000 tons of grain to Ukraine because, yeah, they rebelled. Yeah, they did what he didn't want them to do, but he was still like, "Look, you're still part of us. We still love you. We're going to try to help as much as we can."
Hmm. So, what do you think happened then to cause about 5.7 to 7 million people, being starved to death? Like,
So
what caused that?
there's a lot of things. The big one was the kulaks, right? The big one was them burning their own crops and killing their own cattle. There were two other factors too. That region already had several famines up until that point. They weren't using modernized farming techniques, and there was also a fungus that was raging and just completely destroying crops. But the big, big, big problem was Stalin said, "Okay, you're going to feed everyone," and the kulaks said, "No, we're not."
So you don't think that it could have been the fact that they couldn't accept outside aid, that all of their household foodstuffs were being confiscated by the government, that they couldn't even leave the area? You don't think that had some possible influence on the fact that 7 million people were starved to death? I mean, usually with the famine, so let's say all those things are true. It's like, well, the kulaks, the shitty guys in the neighborhood, are stealing and hoarding all the food and burning everything. Okay, and there's a mushroom fungus, whatever, that's going through. All that stuff is true. Let's just assume, and I disagree on the severity of that as an influence, but we'll just accept it for now. The fact that they couldn't even accept outside aid, the fact that they couldn't even leave, to me shows that it was meant to murder. How can you justify the fact that they couldn't leave?
So I've never heard those things. I'm just being completely honest with you. So if you have sources on that, I'd love to see them
Yeah.
after this.
So,
Um,
do you know Robert Conquest, The Great Terror Reassessment? It's basically it's like the book that sort of creates the I guess what you would say as the Western perspective of what happened in the Soviet Union. I think it's a very fair book. I haven't seen anything drastically wrong when reading it, but that's sort of where I got that from. I mean, to me, it
let me
doesn't
write
make
that
any
down
sense.
real quick. What was that again? Let me write that down real quick.
It's Robert Conquest, The Great Terror. I think this is the book that if you want to develop counter arguments to what I'm saying, you should totally read this because you'll probably disagree with everything in it.
Yeah,
So
I mean, as far as I know, and I've not seen your source, but as far as I know, that is not true because Stalin himself sent 300,000, tons of grain. Like, if he did that, why would he stop, let's say, Britain from helping out if they wanted
I
to?
have no idea. I mean, to me, like that, to me, what that showed was, I mean, I can make it, but here I could explain it if there's another theory. Here's some other aspects of it that was in the book. Authorities banned all discussion of the famine, so that's sketchy. We can't even talk about it. I think Ukrainian historian Stanislav Kulchitsky stated that the government ordered him to falsify his findings and depict the famine as an unavoidable natural disaster to absolve the Communist Party and uphold the legacy of Stalin. So there were actual historians that were living in that area. Most of the people in Ukraine today who experienced the famine agree that the dictator Joseph Stalin was the direct contributor to the fact that this happened. So it just seems like, I get what you're saying. There might have been other factors too, but it seemed like in Stalin's mind, what I could imagine is, okay, we got these fucking guys in Ukraine. They're, causing all kinds of trouble. They're not unifying. They're not pure in the vision of the class consciousness of the communist revolution. They just need to be wiped out so we can ensure that the revolution maintains course. Like, I get it, but it's kind of crazy.
I really don't think that's what he did because again, he sent that grain afterwards. I mean, listen, Stalin did some terrible things, right? He banned homosexuality, and there's just some things that are not exactly defensible. Like you talked about the Great Purge, right? Or did you say Great Terror?
Well, the Great Purge. Yeah, I know about that. I was thinking more about the Holodomor famine.
Right, I got you. But just to let you know, I don't say Stalin did nothing wrong. But as far as Holodomor goes, I believe 98% of that is on the kulaks. Because let's say I'm general secretariat today, and I tell, I don't know, Iowa, hey Iowa, you're now the breadbasket of the United States. If Iowa goes and starts burning down their own goddamn crops, that's Iowa's fault. I'm still
Yeah,
not
but
going to
yeah.
starve, but
Mhm.
that's their cause. That's what caused Holodomor, by and large.
But I mean, wouldn't it be nice if the innocent bystanders who were just trying to survive could leave and not starve to death? I mean, that's the thing that got me. And wouldn't it be nice if we could at least talk about it? I mean, it was illegal to even
So
talk about what was
it would be
happening.
wonderful if the innocent bystanders could have had food, but no, the kulaks wanted to burn the crops.
But I mean, in most famines, when they happen, they could leave and they could go somewhere where they could join a collectivized farm and make food for the community. I'm sure many were willing to do that, but they were starved to death along with see, this is what I get a lot with Stalin. A lot of it was that the ends justified the means, that
Now,
the
my
ends.
guess is this, and I'm sorry, just real quick to address that
Mhm.
point. My guess is this: they were probably allowed to go anywhere within the USSR, but they probably were not allowed to go to capitalist countries,
No,
which
no, no.
completely makes
Literally,
sense.
they were not allowed to leave that very specific area that the famine
Okay,
was in. And
I
the
would
way
love to see that source.
okay, I mean, I think everything's in the book, but
Okay,
but the way that I think the way he justified it publicly in the press was that he didn't want the famine to spread, as if it was some kind of virus that could spread with the people leaving. So it was really weird and it was sketchy, and I think that's something that you should investigate. I'll look up the 300,000 tons of grain thing, and I'll after this and link
yeah,
it.
we can. If I can talk to Tommy, he's got the sources that we did for our
Mhm.
debate with Lawrence. I can send you that whole thing.
Yeah,
But
that'd be
we researched Holodomor. Oh my God, like at least for 4 or 5 hours, and we didn't find anything about that. We didn't find anything about people not being allowed to leave or anything like that.
I mean, I'm sure. Like, I mean, if I let me see, I'm sure this is like the very basic fund narrative that is being pushed by the Western society. And so, even if you think it's lies or wrong, this is important stuff to know. I guess we could move on. Um, so let's see here. Well, I'm trying to look at what the book said Stalin defined as kulak. So a kulak was any peasant who owned land or livestock, or any peasant even selling surplus goods in the market could be labeled a kulak. So that basically there was a very select few peasants who were able to manage to climb out of their meager squalor and able to actually create a successful farm. And they were essentially murdered systematically for this. And there were people, basically the people of the village, their job was to identify who the kulak was in the village so that they could be arrested or targeted or confiscate all their stuff. And so it created this mass paranoia of people constantly, turning on each other. So to me, like this systematic cruelty and terror that's being, uh, you know, uh, surrounded around this entire situation. The fact you couldn't even talk about it
So
anywhere.
real quick, a kulak was somebody who basically owned land, right? So they were kind of like your middle class, and you described it a way that I wouldn't describe it, right? They climbed out of their squalor, right? I would argue, as a communist, as a socialist, that literally all of Ukraine would have climbed out of their squalor much faster and much better if they had just done what Stalin told them to do. Because you know what the result of Stalin's policies were? He increased
Industrialization, yes.
right. He also increased the average lifespan of his nation by over 20 years. I mean, he did some great things. Yes, there
Mhm.
was sketchy tactics, there was some paranoia, there were some things that did not need to happen, and he let Eshoff basically run a fucking muck.
Uh-huh.
But at the end of the day, if people had just listened to Stalin and done what Stalin said, there would not have been that mass famine. That would not have happened.
Okay, well, to me that doesn't make sense because there are plenty of capitalist nations that also went through an industrial revolution, and the consequences were not. I mean, they sucked. They were awful, but they were not nearly as tragic as what happened in the Soviet Union. Like and not only from just a sheer death count, because like that's boring to just go off a death count. I'm talking about the cultural, like just the just the quality of life and essence of living in the Stalin era, where essentially you were in constant fear of everything that you said. I mean, just living with that fear. that anything you said could be possibly interpreted as being against the party, the lack of freedom of speech, all of those individual liberties that would be great. And the fact that, obviously you couldn't be gay, and that's something that persists today in Russia. So there's a million things that were deeply, deeply wrong, fundamentally and culturally. And it didn't seem to need to be that way. There could have been a traditional capitalist industrialization like Great Britain did, like the United States was already
Okay.
did.
So I apologize to cut you off, but let's try to handle one topic at a time. So you brought up Great Britain, right? Let's talk about Great Britain for a little bit. Let's talk about the fact that homosexuality, for example. Do you know how long it was before they stopped castrating gay people in Great Britain?
I have no idea.
1967. So not only was it illegal to be gay, if you were caught being gay, you were castrated. Honestly, the narrative in the world that capitalism good, capitalism freedom, not the case. Your first right in the Soviet Union actually was your right to criticize. You were allowed to criticize the government. Western people will tell you, no, that's not the case. There was complete totalitarian control. And you can find some Stalin quotes where he says, well, we don't let our enemies have guns, so why do we let them have ideas? Yes, paranoid, bad. But the USSR did have the right to criticism. It was one of the first rights you were given. Capitalism is not necessarily freedom.
That seems completely antithetical to every piece of historical document and evidence I've ever seen, or interviews with the people who lived there. There was no ability for you to criticize Stalin or the government. The guy was so absolutely paranoid about his image, and he should be. He's the one dude holding up the entire substructure of the entire society of tens and tens of millions of people. So I don't. Even if Stalin said something, that's not enough to say that that's what was the actual policy that was in order. Because there was the Great Purge. How do you justify the Great Purge, or do you believe it happened?
So most of what happened with the Great Purge was done by a man named Nikolai Ezhov, and Stalin actually put a stop to it for the most part once he found out. There was a whole conspiracy that went on. I believe Trotsky was involved as well. It was a whole thing to try and make Stalin look bad. But yeah, he could have handled that better. He could have found out sooner. He could have stopped it sooner. But most of the kind of blood is on Eslov's shoulders.
So you don't think it's a coincidence that it was about 1.2 million people, right, who were involved in this, and you don't. That's a lot, and you don't think that it's a coincidence that those happen to be systematically targeted enemies of Stalin and his regime. That to me, the fact, think about if that happened now, like if Trump started systematically arresting everybody who was an enemy of the state, right? And then he would say, oh no, it was this guy who's under me, who I'm supposed to be managing correctly. This guy actually was doing all that. I just happened to follow everything in my favor. I would be very skeptical of the motivations of that. That wouldn't, to me, it'd be just self-apparent that no, Stalin, for one, it's your responsibility. You took management and leadership of this country as the total dictator, and two, these are your enemies. I don't believe you. I don't know why you're.
So I apologize to interrupt one more time. He was not he was not a total dictator. He had to answer to people as well. There was a whole government there. I can get you the sources after this. We had a whole thing. I did not know we were going to talk about Stalin, so I did not bring it with me today. But I can get.
Oh, it's totally cool. I don't want to swamp you in facts or something. I totally. I understand what you're saying. I have never heard of the fact that Stalin necessarily had to answer to anyone. It was always that his word went, and that every bureaucracy below him was either a facade, or it was basically just a means to execute his commands. But if you have contrary evidence, I'd actually be very interested in reading that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to get you a research doc. But cool. Even fundamentally, when we talk about communism, right, we're talking about dictatorship of the proletariat. At the end of the day, he was accountable to the proletariat, and maybe he didn't. What's the word I'm looking for here? He didn't typify that the way I would like to see. Again, I would say I love Stalin for his theory. I love what he's taught me about communism. But if I were to point to a leader that I think this is who I would emulate if I was going to do the same thing, it would be Thomas Sankara.
But I think that it's important to understand how Stalin became, because look, so you call him a dictatorship of the proletariat, that he represents these people. Cool. But he wasn't really duly elected. There wasn't any systemic democratic process to see that he actually was representing them. He sort of just took power, in this during this whole political, schism that was happening with Lenin and his various other competitors, and he sort of stepped in and took a leading role. And then when Lenin died, sort of solidified power. So I wouldn't say that as a process that could be represented as, okay, I represent you, the proletariat. He might have said that, but the only way to actually meaningfully have that word make sense is if there was some representation, and there really wasn't. I mean, Stalin didn't even know about a lot of the stuff that was going on in the Soviet Union.
You had mentioned you read some theory, right? I assume you've read the Communist Manifesto?
Long time ago. Yeah.
So Marx and Engels lay out the kind of fundamental basics in the manifesto, right? One of the things in the manifesto is the dictatorship of the proletariat, and what we mean by that is there's two types of classes in a communist society. There's the proletariat and there's the Communist Party. And depending on what you do government style, depending on the revolution, you may have elected officials. And you're going to disagree with me on this, but in Cuba, they do have elections. They actually do have elections for their communist members. Now, I do not know the direct method of how the Communist Party was elected in the USSR off the top of my head, but I can tell you that there was some accountability, right? He was accountable to the Communist Party, which represents the proletariat.
To me, okay, well, let's look at the structure of that. So essentially in the communist society, the Marxist-Leninist society particularly, because I mean, some would say that the true communist society is classless, stateless. It's just,
Oh, absolutely. Socialism
right.
is the road to that, and that's what we've seen so far. Is we've seen socialism.
Yes. So I would say that, anyways, point is, let's look at what's actually happening with the power structures, because I see in the Marxist-Leninist sort of structure that it's basically replicating the exact same thing that existed in capitalism, but under different names. So you would see, for instance, you have the proletariat who work in the companies. The people who run the companies make sure that they are meeting their quotas and everything are the managers. Those managers then, speak to the local official who makes sure that everything in that local, province is meeting expectations. Then that guy speaks to this guy, eventually get to Stalin, right? These are still preserved power hierarchies. The proletariat who are working, in these, conditions of, digging ditches or making tools or whatever, they don't really have a decision. They're not deciding what their labor is being used for. They're taking orders from people above who have decided for them what their labor should be used for, which to me completely obliterates the only good thing I liked about communism, where it's like, well, the workers seize the means of production, which means that they actually have control over what the profits are used for, of what is being made, of everything. And that doesn't seem to exist at all in the USSR or in any of these large-scale communist revolutions.
So a couple of things to address. When we talk about socialism, right, a lot of times people will make the mistake and they'll think socialism and communism think same thing. They're not. So socialist revolutions are what we've seen so far. And an ML like myself, we would say that socialism is the only thing we can achieve probably for the next couple of generations, because what's going to have to happen is we're going to have socialism to transition into communism. And what that means is we use the vestiges of capitalism. So yes, we'll still have some form of currency. Yes, we'll probably still have some form of hierarchy. But eventually the goal is to get to a stateless classless society.
Yeah.
The problem is we have to kind of retrain humans on how to be collective instead of being individualistic. We have to retrain humans to think a different way. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but I'm just curious. Have you ever seen Star Trek The Next Generation by chance?
God, I don't know. So long. I don't remember it, man.
Do you remember the Federation structure? That's kind of socialism, right? You have a very it is a strict kind of power hierarchy within the Federation, but in general, everyone else lives pretty free. It's mostly just in Starfleet that you actually see the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, look, but the thing is when we're looking outside of whatever science fiction, and we're looking at what happened in the USSR.
My phone is blowing up.
Oh, don't worry about it.
Oh, come on. Okay, I should be good. Go ahead.
So when you look at, I mean, it seems like this experiment was run, right? Because I totally understand. I know that socialism is the transitionary state into a true communist society, and I know that the way they think about that is that because people and societies and communities, it goes all the way back down to dialectical materialism, are purely reflections and manifestations of the physical reality and these class structures that exist around them. That they're essentially just, like, water that can be shaped into whatever shape that a community or society wants them to be. Um, it seems though that in every single type of society that this was tried in, I mean, you have China, which is a very, very, I mean, it's about the most collectivist society, like just naturally in terms of their culture that I can think of. I mean, they follow Confucius ideas, which is about social harmony, which very easily sort of links in with what communist ideas would have. And even in those areas, there was never any true communist society that emerged. It always eventually collapsed into some sort of, state capitalism, or actually into a democracy, quote unquote, like what happened in Russia. And so it always seems to fail, like, and miserably, and with large death counts to sort of follow. And it doesn't seem to, even during the revolution, like you said, there's all of these capitalist power structures that are preserved. So what the hell is it doing? It just doesn't seem to be doing anything. Like that's what
the number one thing that it would do, right, is it would start to kind of equalize society. We would get rid of the bourgeoisie. That would be the main kind of benefit of socialism. We would no longer have your Bill Gates, your Jeff Bezos, stuff like that. But to backtrack a little bit, where you
but wait, I really want to nail this point. So we wouldn't have those capitalists, but we would still have the government officials that effectively would have the same power. It's just a different name of what they are, but they still have the same power.
But there would be no one starving, right? So, like,
there were 7 million people who starved in Ukraine.
Right? We have a whole lot more food in the United States than we ever need. We have a whole lot more shelter. I think it's 22,000 more homes than we need. We make it to where no one goes starving, no one goes without shelter. Yes, there were mistakes in the USSR. I'm not going to defend the USSR staunchly. I'm not a tanky. What I will say is I wanted to go back, and this kind of goes with this. You said that there was no example of socialism. I would, again, point to Burkina Faso.
Communism.
Cara. Right, and you're not going to see communism probably for 100, maybe 200 years, because, again, you have to train that out of people. And I'm going to go back to Star Trek for just a moment. What turned them into socialist and then into communist was the world was able to come together because aliens landed on Earth. It's a very lofty goal, but I think what would have to happen for communism to happen is everyone would have to be under the idea of, okay, I'm tired of people starving. I'm tired of people not having education. I'm tired of people not living when we have Jeff Bezos, who has almost $1 billion. I think that would have to be taught into people's minds. So, yeah, it's going to take some time. It's going to take generations.
Well, I would actually say that the communist society could emerge in a post-scarcity society. That's the only way I could see it ever emerging naturally. Because here's there's so much more I want to get into, but this is actually another one of my major points. The issue with these societies is that they are actually just not as efficient or as effective in terms of production as capitalist societies are. That's why even Marx would sort of agree with that. That's why he saw capitalism as the engine that created the foundation of factories and everything that we could then use in the communist sort of society. He knew how good capitalism was at making stuff, right? And so this is actually a very key important thing, because if there's ever any war or any sort of conflict, it seems to always have been the capitalist nations who can produce the most things, who can produce the most weapons, who actually are able to survive the longest without internal collapse, like what happened in the Soviet Union, the most stable, that can preserve themselves long enough. And so that's sort of this thing where it's like, I just don't think that this revolution can happen until resources are so plentiful that there's actually no real reason to pick one economic system over the other. It's all about now essentially what the society's preference of how to live.
That's the thing, though. We're already there. We're already at a place where we produce more food than we need. We have more shelter than we need. we're already there. We've been there since Kropotkin. I don't know if you read any Kropotkin. I don't like the man, but I mean, even back in the 1800s, he did a calculation, several calculations that proved that man could and should go the socialist, well, actually more just ANCOM route, right? We're already in a post-scarcity world. There's more shelter than we need. Where there's more food than we need. I don't think we're waiting for that. I think that's already here.
But here's the thing. I don't think we're in a post-scarcity world, because what you're saying is that you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. There's a reason why there's a lot of stuff here to redistribute. And you're saying, well, so now in this current state, we have a surplus of stuff that we can redistribute, but I want to destroy the factory underneath that's producing it. Essentially, that is
the factory. You'd still have the machinery.
No, that's not what I'm saying. The factory, I'm using that as a metaphor.
No, I get you, but I'm still saying that the machinery is what made this, right? It's not capitalism that makes us have more than we need. It's our modern industrial nations. And we can still run that under socialism.
I don't think so. I think there is something particular about capitalism, and I can explain what that is. Because capitalism is basically a game that we all play, and we've sort of either been forced to play or have decided to play. And it's a game that seems to produce very effective results. And this is something I actually cover in one of my few political TikToks, which is that capitalism is essentially the game is whoever contributes the most to the efficiency of the structure of the system, of the production of goods or services, will be rewarded in the form of profit. And there's an unfair dynamic to that, because if you're born with more money, right, you have a greater leverage that you can stick into the ground to pull more, essentially more efficiency. So if you start out rich and you basically invest your money well, you can get richer way easier. So that's the sort of fundamental, inequality. But it just seems to be, and it's just empirically seems to be, that the societies that are capitalist tend to be more efficient and productive at producing things. And so what you're saying is, well, we have a bunch of stuff now, so we can just get rid of the system that continuously creates that stuff and move on to something else. But what happened in the Soviet Union is that there were a lot of, especially towards the end, the quality of food was going down. The amount of food was going down. I don't want to spread too many.
I apologize to interrupt, but we're going all over the place again.
Yeah,
so
I know.
Let's start with the game thing, right? So yeah, I agree. Capitalism is a game, and that's the problem, because some people lose the game. Some people end up homeless. They end up starving. They end up dying. And that's what we seek to do with socialism. We seek to equalize everything. We seek to equally make sure everybody has the same advantages. And again, I do not believe that it's capitalism that creates the prosperity that we see. I think capitalism actually makes it worse, because you have supply and demand, which we won't get too much into because we're pretty much at the end here. But I would just suffice it to say, I don't think it's capitalism that's got us to the post-scarcity world. I think it's an industry.
Well, we're not post-scarcity. Post-scarcity would basically mean infinite resources. So there's literally, everything would be free, essentially.
And I would disagree with that too, because I would say post-scarcity is we have more food, we have more water, we have more everything than we need.
But there's a cost for everything that we have. But in a post-scarcity society, it's very distinct in the sense that energy would be so plentiful that you could create, you like science fiction, but you could create anything with a particle accelerator, essentially. If you want a gold ring, there's so much energy that we're able to take from the sun or from nuclear fusion or whatever, that we would be able to essentially have anything we wanted materially for free. And that's the only state of time that I see that communism could actually manifest itself in a sustainable way. But I really want to go back to what you were saying about the machine and not being productive. I'm not saying that the people within the machine, the players, aren't actually the ones contributing to the production, aren't the real contributors 100% to the production. I'm saying that the game itself, the way it's set up, seems to incentivize large production of things. And here's I really want to nail this. I think we can have a capitalist society and avoid homelessness, avoid starvation, avoid all of these things. We've already seen capitalist countries do this. You have a lot of liberal countries like, in Scandinavia, who have accomplished most of these goals. Even prisoners are given unbelievable luxuries. And so it seems like we can actually accomplish most of your concerns through a reformism, which is, and even seizing the means of production could be done gradually through cooperatives, although I'm very skeptical of cooperatives, but I think they're interesting. And so there seems to be a lot of ways that we can do the things that you want to do. Let's make people not starve, all that. Maintain personal civil liberties, but the capitalist system machine that produces all the goods is there, but we redistribute it properly, right? And so that's probably closer to where I would be. And so I just don't understand why that wouldn't suffice.
So we'll kind of get to our final closing here because we're almost at 50 minutes. So I would just say that the thing that would kind of prevent that is the bourgeoisie is always going to try to retain control, right? When it comes to let's say Jeff Bezos, for example, you know what he's been doing over the last 10 years. He's been basically pricing people out of the market. And capitalism, like you said, is a game, right? It's competition. There's going to be a winner to that game. And I don't think there's a way to solve homelessness or starvation or anything like that with capitalism intact, because at some point, someone's going to win the game, someone's going to have a monopoly, and somebody's going to charge whatever they want for that loaf of bread. I don't think capitalism is salvageable. I think the bourgeoisie are always going to be grabbing for more and more and more.
So then why do we have examples of capitalist countries that have accomplished these things and that can manage and regulate their monopolies? That can,
so you know how much in debt they are, right? They also have a lot of other problems. They also rely on overseas labor. They rely on sweatshops and things like that. There is no ethical consumption under capitalism.
Well, basically every country in the northern hemisphere is doing that, and that's sort of
they're all capitalist, aren't they?
I mean, that's sort of the problem. I don't think that's probably necessarily an issue of capitalism, because these sorts of inequalities and disparities across the northern and southern hemisphere have basically existed for the vast majority of history now. But I don't think Scandinavia, like Norway's debt is that much. It's not that much. It's 153 billion. Let me look at per capita. Actually, let me see. Debt.
I mean, it's definitely less, but they're still in a deficit. You know what I mean?
But that's fine. Deficits and debt is actually fine. I mean, this is kind of, I don't know, this is a bit of an economic idea. And if, for people who are watching, I study business, so this is kind of my thing here. But the going into debt is actually perfectly fine as long as it is comparable and at least under a certain amount % per GDP. Because what that shows is that you're taking debt and you're actually integrating that into productivity the next quarter. So debt is fine. It's only when it gets over a certain amount. So there's nothing really necessarily wrong with debt. Debt has existed forever. I mean, in a hunter-gatherer civilization, you would go out with your friend and you could say, well, I'm going to hunt the caribou tonight. You go back and set up the tent, and then the next day I'll make sure to set up the tent for you, and the next day you'll go do this. There's long-term ledgers of debt that have been set up that people write down in small,
Yeah, no, I 100% get you on that. It's just like a personal credit score, right? You want to have some kind of credit so that creditors can see that you're capable of handling it.
Yeah, so there's nothing wrong with debt.
But I still, at the end of the day, even if we're not talking about that, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. You still have your sweatshops and things like that. With that said, I'm really sorry to kind of keep this tight, but I do have something to do here in a little bit. So let's start the Q&A session if we can.
Okay, yeah, let's go ahead.
Yeah, we have about 5 people watching. We had about 15 or 20 at the start, but I think we lost some people when we started talking about kulaks. Any questions? We have about 8 minutes for questions. I'd be happy to do this again sometime if you want. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was really fun. I wish we could go.
You can also, if you want, we have a Discord. Not just me is there. All of us are there. So if you want to join that, that's open too. We might not have any questions.
People are satisfied.
Well, it's less that and more that TikTok wanted to make my advertisements not work today.
So I guess we can go through what people said. Individualism is in human nature. I never really said it was. I was just talking about the Bible and how that promotes individualism as a fundamental.
Oh, wait. We have one. Here's one. I'll put it on the screen. Do you ever think you'll actually convince someone to change their side? We'll both answer this. I'll start with this. I think it's very rare that's going to happen because people are very, I don't know what's the word I want to use. For the most part, like on social media, people are very dogmatic about what they believe.
Mm-hmm.
So it may not happen very often, quite honestly. How about you?
I thing is like I tend to be able to change people's minds when I'm in a relationship with them. So
That
over
might be a
time,
little toxic.
yeah, it's like it's over good discussion like this. You know, we just talk and slowly I kind of shift them more towards, because a lot of the times I date leftists. It's a thing. I don't know what that's about. And slowly I kind of move them a bit more conservative, and they slowly move me a bit left, and I've kind of found this equilibrium. So I think people tend to, as long as you can understand that the side you're arguing with, and if you can find that the side you're arguing with has the same goals and aspirations, right? I want the maximum well-being for humanity, and me and Crazybeard just disagree on the systems and games that we should play to achieve those things, and what systems and games we've played that
I always thought that was
yeah,
funny. Matt.
yes sir, yeah. So
We're better than that here.
I don't know, it works, right?
As a feminist, I would disagree. But all right. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and call it since we don't have any questions. Thank you so much. You said Corey?
Yep.
Thank you, Corey. I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast. You guys have a wonderful day, everybody who showed up. Take care.
All right, take care, man.